So this first lecture is about high-resolution functional protocol optimization and data acquisition. It's really using the concepts that Saskia just now introduced and trying to make it a bit more kind of practical how you use that in your everyday life. And before I go into that, I want to show you this list of exciting lectures out there, which is partly even more in depth than what I can show you today. Namely here these videos from Saskia, from Maxime, from Miha Furderer or Rüdiger Stirnberg. Excellent resources out there to really understand not only the principles of EPI, but also the higher order effect and how this limits us with respect to layer-dependent fMRI at the end. So in the next 2 lectures, I will go through points 1 to 5. Saskia already introduced the toolkit and was talking about concepts. And in the remainder of these sessions, I will try to get more and more into the specifics. This means that I'm going to be more and more practical, but will be less and less generalizable. It's less about conceptual overviews. So first, I want to familiarize yourself with the kind of common trade-offs that are being done with layer-dependent fMRI. Then I will talk about common issues when setting up a layer-dependent fMRI study, and I will specifically do that with respect to deep brain structure. And the reason because I want to talk about common issues for deep brain structure is because we have all the issues that we have in layer-dependent fMRI. They're just clearer, more amplified, and a bit more educational to understand, but similarly apply to any other conventional layer-dependent fMRI. Then I will try to become even more practical and talk about how you want to tweak your acquisition for a given neuroscience study and vice versa, how you harmonize your paradigm with your protocol. Then almost last, I will give you a walkthrough on how we perform layer-dependent fMRI studies at the scanner. And at the end, we have a tiny little quiz. So let's start talking about these trade-offs. I think the most relevant trade-off to consider when setting up a layer-dependent fMRI is this triangle. We want to have good coverage, resolution, and TR. And usually when you ask a neuroscientist, they want everything, right? They want whole brain with sub-second TR and a few hundred micron resolution, which is asking for a bit much, which is not possible. Usually you can kind of pick 2 out of 3. And as soon as you push one of them more, you need to make more sacrifices with the others. So let's talk about resolution, coverage, and TR, starting by resolution. So in resolution, Saskia, in her review article in Progress in Neurobiology, made an overview, meta-analysis of all the fMRI studies published in NeuroImage, and she found that the average of all the fMRI studies has about a resolution of 3.12. It's thicker than 3 millimeters isotropic, and that's about the thickness if you add 2 quarter coins on top of each other. Now, for layer-dependent fMRI, it has kind of evolved over the last decades or so, and the most commonly used resolution and most standard is 0.8 millimeter, which is the thickness of a credit card. That's already quite thick. And usually people consider 0.8 to be the limit of what's doable in a 2-hour experiment. I don't really believe that, and it's, I think, mostly coming from this hand-wavy rule of thumb that the TSNR or SNR is directly proportional to the voxel volume, which in a conceptual theoretical framework makes sense. I don't believe it in practice. I think it's rather misleading to have this law of voxel size directly corresponding to a resolution. It's a relative relationship, right? And there's no clear absolute value to that. There is no physical law out there that predicts the TSNR based on the voxel size. It depends on much more than just the voxel size. So I would make the claim that you can choose any resolution that you like, dependent on your experimental setup. For example, in humans, you can easily go up an order of magnitude without scanning 10 times longer or 100 times longer to account for the square root of n. In fact, you can go to the size of these little wiggles here at the Fine-Bergertron scanner and not only see kind of different partial voluming of upper and deeper layers, but actually Nyquist sample the layers in humans here. And that's not the limit at all. In fact, when you look at what the animal folks do out there, and they're usually 1 or 2 decades ahead in their development, they can go up to 200 microns, right? That's half an order of magnitude added on top of it. So it's now the thickness of a banknote. That's very, very, very small voxels. And of course, from a physics perspective, physics doesn't care which kind of species you're on, right? So if it's doable in animals, why shouldn't it be doable in humans? with a correspondingly optimized experimental or sequence setup. And also usually when I try to see if my resolution is doable, I'm not only seeing what other people are doing or looking at the square root of the voxel volume only, but basically also trying to orient myself on what people can do in structural imaging. Usually the limit in structural imaging is further than with functional imaging, but not so much. It's usually 1-2 orders of magnitude in there. And when you look at the structural imaging results that are published out there, you can go to 12 micron. That's many orders of magnitude smaller than what you can do, for example, here for functional imaging. So, of course, with structural imaging or ex vivo here, you can scan longer, right? You can scan an entire weekend if you want. Though a weekend is not that much longer in the sense of orders of magnitude. For example, a weekend has like 50 hours, and 50 is just 7 squared. So we would expect that anything you can do over a weekend is just a factor 7 better SNR than we have in a 2-hour session. But here we are not talking about a factor of 7, but almost 5 orders of magnitude. So this tells us that you can always achieve any resolution that you want, given your experimental setup, and you basically always should use the resolution that is needed for your neuroscience experimental question. To make this claim clearer, I would like to show you this toy example here, where data have been acquired at slightly better resolution than 0.5 isotropic, where you can see that you have this kind of double bump Nyquist sampling of the superficial and pile responses as opposed to the deeper layers over there. And as you retrospectively downsample those data, you can see that at about 0.6, 0.7, you see that this Nyquist sampling basically breaks down. At 0.8, you see it's not just an inverted U, but you have this kind of plateau up there. So basically the layers up there still have more partial voluming of voxels that are in superficial layers as opposed to those down there that do have more partial voluming with the deeper voxels. And therefore 0.8, given a cortical thickness of about 2 to 4 millimeters, is usually considered that a kind of a limit. If you have lower resolution than that, you have a harder time defending that in front of your reviewer. And here, this is another example, also referring to a previous study that looked at the resolution dependence, where in monkeys here provided from Yusin Guanze, you can see that for 0.3 millimeters, you have this nice Nyquist sampling of 2 separate peaks of the superficial imperial peak and the deeper peak. And at 0.6, it kind of starts to fade away. At 0.8, you still have this kind of slope plateau. But if you go to coarser resolution in 0.8, it kind of breaks down. And you can see this also in the animation here. So if I downsample retrospectively, you can kind of see I'm going up again. So at about 0.5, you still see indications of these superficial voxels separately, but then at about 0.8, it's just a matter of different partial voluming, which might still be usable for neuroscience. And in fact, there are a lot of good studies out there that showed that 0.8 millimeter can give you enough spatial resolution to resolve different neural components and different neural processing across cortical depth. If you look into practice and just go to the scanner and start with a conventional 0.8 millimeters lab protocol, here, for example, at 3 Tesla, and it just increased the resolution, you can see that at 0.8, it kind of still looks okay. It's certainly noisy, as always. With 0.7, weird things start to appear. It's definitely more noisy, and at about 0.5 millimeter, the data certainly become unusable. Not only because of the thermal noise, but because also that the EPI readout just breaks down. So I think the common consensus in the field is that most layer fMRI for most of the cortical thicknesses between 2 and 4 millimeter requires at about 0.8 millimeter. Anything sub-millimeter, I think, can still be argued with. If you are lower than that, you need very fancy methods to really prove that you are sensitive to layers. So coming back to this triangle, we talked about resolution, and 0.8 is actually pushing it quite a bit compared to the standard of more than 3 millimeters. So this means that we do not really have a lot of leeway anymore with the other 2 parameters, the coverage and the TR. So let's talk about coverage next, which I think is actually really needed to have good coverage in layer-dependent fMRI. There's this kind of paradox that layer fMRI is inherently a method that can look at connectivity, right? We see if it's feed-forward connections that come in, or if it's feedback connections that come in, or if it's input or output, like in this example of the motor cortex, here seeing these different stripes in the gray matter in EPI. But it's ironic that this kind of connectivity method usually is only looked at in individual brain areas. So we're not really seeing where this connectivity is coming from. So where this feedback or where this feed-forward input is coming in. So there has been a lot of development in the last years to make this kind of not only a single brain area, but basically an entire slab, and then stacking slabs further and further on top of each other to end up with something like whole brain. But this comes at a cost of the other parameters. For example, at 0.8 with whole brain, it takes at least 5 seconds to acquire it. But then you might be able to get okay-ish data. So here in this study from Kenju, for example, we not only characterized this kind of parameter space of how fast we can go, but basically also we characterized the repeatability, the data quality for kind of neuroscience application studies or connectivity studies, like here for movie watching paradigms across many sessions. But there's a price. It's just a 5-second volume TR. And this is usually a price that most people do not want to pay because it's slow. And if you want to be even more ambitious and go to even higher resolution, not 0.8 but 0.6, you have so many slices that it just takes like 11 seconds to get a fairly decent whole brain experiment here again for connectivity with a head gradient from some of the best scanners around the world, namely here in this case the Fine-Bergertron scanner in Berkeley. Or if you use very advanced sequences for whole brain connectivity analyses, it just takes time here from these examples from the Jülich group. Or if you have some of the strongest magnets out there, a 10.5 Tesla scanner in Minnesota, still it just takes a lot of time to acquire an entire volume. So we talked about resolution and coverage. Then let's talk about TR. How fast can we sample? And I think most of the things that I learned about how fast we can sample is from the study from Sebastian Dresbach here, really trying to push the TR sub-second volume acquisition to eventuate it layer-dependent fMRI. But you see kind of the coverage. It's less than 10% of the brain is covered. But it's possible, right? And then you can maybe look at these very faint differences of the hemodynamic response functions then. But the big hit and the price that you need to pay is not only coverage, but also TSNR, because you have more excitations. You are more aggressive with respect to acceleration and bandwidth. So you might have more samples across time, but the sampling efficiency is actually lower. You need longer experiments with those short TRs to have the same detection threshold as you would have with a slow TR. And there is very little signal actually visible at those high temporal frequencies. There might be tiny differences of superficial and deeper layers that are visible when you sample very fast as opposed to sample slower. However, they are very small. Which might also be visible in this exciting experiment here from Luca. I just happen to be in the picture. I'm not involved in the study, where you see that here in superficial and deepest layers, there are these very faint modulations of the task conditions here that are different for very unique point in time. But you see that they are much smaller, these differences, as opposed to the overall response. So you have a huge hit in a SNR and you have a huge hit in your effect size, which might also be visible in this exciting study here, looking at the responsiveness across different time scales from Daniel Gomez, where you can see that for very fast acquisition and very fast stimulation, here these deep layers are kind of shifted. But the effect size of these responses are like almost an order of magnitude smaller, as if you would have kind of a 10-second stimulus here in the range of 2%. So you pay a huge price in slices and effect size if you want to go fast. If you are at the scanner and you think your protocol is just too slow and you want to increase the TR, that's always possible. People might not advise you to go there, but the TR is basically a free parameter you can choose. And one parameter that you can trade-off for TR is basically kappa. So if 5-second volume TR is just too slow for you, you can go to 4 seconds with more kappa, and you can go to 3 seconds or 2 seconds. But at the end, you see that it's possible. You can even go to 1 second if you want, but the data will be unusable. It will just be artifacts. And then it's usually dependent on the study and on your question of where you want to make your cut and say, okay, now the data are unusable. While we have this triangle of coverage, TR, and resolution, it's usually kind of not a completely fixed triangle. So I want to also highlight the fact that if you have a specific scanner or specific sequences out there or hardware, you can maybe sometimes kind of increase this triangle and actually push on multiple of those parameters at the same time. And one classic example here would be field strength. So if you're used to doing layer-dependent fMRI at 3 Tesla, you can go to 7 Tesla and push more parameters at the same time. Because at 3 Tesla, you cannot really push anything. If you want to have layer resolution, then you need to make sacrifices already completely with TR and coverage. And if you want to have more coverage, then you can go to 7 Tesla while also scanning faster if you want. And so field strength is one thing, and you can do layer-dependent fMRI across any field strength that you like if you just scan long enough. Another thing aside of field strength would be advanced gradients or RF coils. So again, here showing from David Feinberg scanner that you can do a whole brain 0.8 millimeter resolution and protocol with advanced head gradients and advanced RF coils that has pretty decent quality and is actually faster as if you would do the same thing on a conventional 7 Tesla Terra or 70 plus in this case. So you can push more parameters than one at the same time. So now that we have this triangle, let's see how we can move that to the scanner and to choose our protocol. Because at the scanner, it looks easy that we have kind of a coverage field and we have a resolution field and we have a TR. But unfortunately, it's more complicated than that we just can trade off these 3 parameters, because those 3 parameters depend on other things and they depend on other things. So usually we need to consider many of those parameters and how they are interacting, which gets very complicated very quickly. And in this lecture now, I would like to give you a bit of a feel of what are the main parameters that we want to play with to get your best optimal protocol for your layer fMRI study. So let's talk about common issues of setting up a layer-dependent fMRI acquisition protocol and those parameters and the degrees of freedom to really optimize the acquisition of the protocol. And I would like to go through the common issues, specifically not only looking at the brain areas that are commonly used for layer-dependent fMRI, but also the deeper brain structures for multiple reasons. Like the first is that when you divide the brain, it's just weird that basically the vast majority of layer-dependent fMRI papers is only looking at the top half, right? But there are a lot of very interesting neuroscience hypotheses that wait to be tested in the deeper brain structures too. But the second reason why I want to exemplify the challenges of setting up a layer-dependent fMRI protocol in deep brain structures is simply because it's just more apparent down there. In those deep brain structures, you just see it much more clearly if your approach or your change in your protocol has a big effect on the data quality at the end. So common areas that are being used in layer-dependent fMRI in the top half are things like the primary motor cortex or DLPFC cognitive areas, primary auditory areas just at the border here, or primary visual areas just above the line over here, or motion sensitive areas like V5MT and so on. But down there are a lot of interesting areas that are like under investigated with respect to neuroscience application studies. For example, looking at the amygdala or looking at the hippocampus or entorhinal cortex, which has very clear hypotheses about memory encoding and retrieval, or looking at like these visual hierarchical processes along the ventral stream, like face perception and those kind of things, or looking at the superior colliculus. There's so much stuff going on down there that requires good layer-dependent fMRI protocols. And the things that are so challenging in those areas are the same things that are challenging everywhere else. It's just worse. For example, here summarized in those 4 different fields that I would like to go through. So this is my outline now for this part of the presentation. First of all, we have SNR issues, where the SNR is kind of okay in the upper part of the brain. It's just horrible down there, specifically if you move far away from the RF receive coils, right? But not only with respect to receive coils, also with the transmit coils we are challenged there, because the flip angles are usually quite decent up there, but to get a good excitation down there, it's just hard. B1 plus is just horrible down there. Or for example, when we look at distortions, geometric distortions in EPI with those low bandwidths that we are using in high resolution protocols, is still kind of manageable up there, but it's horrible down there, almost unmanageable to some degree. And maybe most importantly, in these deep brain structures, we are more challenged with the acquisition speed. So at the upper part of the brain, usually we can have decent sized matrices, EPI matrices, that can be acquired in a single shot by just making the field of view small, right? If you have a given hypothesis about motor cortex or here visual streams or whatever you like, you can kind of align the slab to make it smaller than the brain. In the deep brain structures down there, you just can't, right? No matter how you choose your orientation, it always will be a huge field of view. This means that while we are already limited by having large matrix sizes and a slow speed to acquire our entire K-space, for these huge matrix sizes, it's even worse. So we need about a matrix size of 300. And we just don't have the time to acquire 300 K-space lines in 1 millisecond each before the signal decays away, right? Because the T2 star at 7 Tesla is about 26 or 28 milliseconds. So after 300 milliseconds, everything's gone. We cannot do that, which is challenging, while it is already challenging at the upper brain areas. So let's talk about those different points individually, and let's start by the matrix size. And as we already learned from Saskia's presentation, we acquire our images usually with EPI by having an excitation and then passing through K-space back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And we just don't have enough time to acquire 300 lines before the signal decays away. So we only acquire usually a subset of lines. This means that we have all these missing lines that need to be kind of filled in by other means. And usually we not only have an individual TR, but actually we have a time series. And if we wouldn't reconstruct these missing lines, we would actually have aliased images, smaller field of views basically. And one very effective and popular way of doing this unaliasing is then to use grappa. So in grappa, you basically look at the individual RF images, and they are usually only looking at or sensitive to a small part of the brain, and anything that's small in image space is smooth in K-space, as vice versa. If you only have the center of K-space, it's smooth in image space, and so on. So this means that when you look at a small field of view from one coil only, we have smoothness in K-space. This means that neighboring K-space lines are actually dependent on each other. So if you didn't acquire each individual K-space line, you can actually use the smoothness constraint of K-space to reconstruct those missing lines, which is done in grappa. However, this means that you are getting an entire image, in this case with twice the number of pixels as your original acquired one. So we have a square root of R SNR penalty, which have less samples acquired, right? On top of that, when there are signals, multiple signals in one voxel, you need to unalias them, which results in noise amplification. So we also have the G factor penalty. There are two penalties if we use those approaches to acquire a large matrix size, but not having enough time to actually acquire every sample along this large matrix size. So another approach would be to not do grappa unaliasing and taking advantage of the smoothness in K-space, but basically using different TRs or shots from different TRs that are acquired with different prephases, and then fill in missing K-space lines by just combining the signals from two different TRs. And you can do that, and then you have less samples compared to grappa, and it might be more comparable as if you would have a running average of the grappa samples. So you basically still have the square root of R SNR penalty, but you don't have the G factor penalty. And the G factor penalty is usually considered to be more thermal noise, and if you do the segmentation, then you are usually more limited by artifact noise, like physiological noise, phase variations, and so on. And dependent on the protocol that you're interested in, or the brain area you're interested in, and the noise characteristics of your setup that you're interested in, you might tend to more use segmentation or grappa or a different combination of both. So let's look at this example here of a deep brain structure slab where we are using the same kind of echo spacing, same EPI factor, the same number of lines per shot, but basically combining them differently. You can either have 6-fold segmentations to get one image without grappa, or 2-fold grappa with 3 segmentations, 3-fold grappa with 2 segmentation, or a lot of grappa without segmentation. And down there you see the data quality, basically the efficiency, the TSNR efficiency, TSNR per square of unit of time. And you see that basically if you do only segmentation, you're really limited by these shot-to-shot variations, by physiological noise. Gray matter is just stark, right? Anything that moves or varies slightest has a huge penalty with respect to SNR, but also any kind of movement is very challenging here. If you use a combination, for example, using 3-fold grappa and 2-fold segmentation seems to be the optimum in this case. You have the highest efficiency. If you do a lot of grappa and no segmentation, you have a lot of samples, independent TRs. However, you're so much limited by G-factor penalty, and basically your coils cannot unalias images, so you have a lot of artifacts and SNR issues. And this is slightly different, this kind of optimum spectrum, if you do go to higher spatial resolution. So now you're more in the thermal noise dominated regime and less in the physiological artifact noise dominated regime. And there you see that the optimum kind of shifts towards the left. It's still not efficient to use only segmentation and no grappa. It's most efficient to use very little grappa and much more segmentation. And if you do more grappa with even less segmentation, you have more samples, but the data become more noisy and inefficient to use. So you want to use a different combination here. However, you still are not SNR limited enough that you have the most benefit by not using grappa at all. Still grappa helps, which again tells us that resolution, even at 0.5 millimeter resolutions, we are still more artifact limit than thermal noise limit. So there's a lot of way to go if we better understand our sources of noise to get to higher and higher and higher resolution. If you look at the cutting edge developments in the field of the last maybe decade or last 5 years at conferences like ISMRAM or so, I think most of the innovations with respect to high resolution acquisitions are really focusing on a good combination of segmentation and grappa. And these sequences have names like EPTI or EPIC or shot selective CAIPI or BIS EPI or line-wise scanning or T-hex or skip CAIPI, you name it. There are a lot of different ways. And I think it is the word on the street that combining segmentation with grappa in the most efficient way is the next big thing in layer-dependent fMRI. However, right now, none of those approaches are really an established method that is used for standard cognitive neuroscience experiments in layer-dependent fMRI. Most of it, at least. So let's talk about the next challenge. Let's talk about TSNR. We are already limited by TSNR by using these small voxels, but down there even more so. And what can we do about it? And one very efficient way or easy way that I found usable to improve your TSNR is just play with the orientation of your slab. For example, here in this study, Andrew Pisicchetti and Sam Aldrin were interested in the ventral areas, but also hippocampus, where you can see that TSNR is basically single digit. It's unusable for these kind of axial protocols. For sagittal, it didn't look so bad. So it matters a lot in kind of how you do use your coil sensitivities to do most efficient grappa acceleration. For example, in axial protocols, basically the elements that you're most sensitive to are aligned in this kind of circle, right? So you only have one spatial dimension for spatial encoding with the coil elements, namely the tangential direction. You cannot really use the coils in the radial direction. There is no sensitivity difference there. In the sagittal view, however, this is different because the individual elements in the 32-channel Nova coil, for example, are aligned in this star-like fashion. This means that when you have a sagittal protocol covering the same areas, you actually do see that we have two spatial dimensions, namely the kind of spoke direction as well as across the different spokes, right? So you have an additional degree of freedom to do grappa and shift your aliases around, which basically lowers your G-factor penalty. This, however, is not generally true for kind of all brain areas, right? For each protocol, acceleration factor, you need to reconsider if your slab orientation is really the best one. For example, when you do whole brain layer dependent fMRI, like in this example, it's actually the other way around. There we really already engage all the elements already, and you can see that we have the best TSNR, in fact, by going to an axial protocol, not sagittal, and the artifacts are even less there. So changing the orientation can boost your TSNR. Another aspect that I would like to talk about with respect to TSNR is the readout sequence in itself. Namely, as Saskia already introduced, there are two different popular families of readout sequences, namely 3D EPI and 2D EPI. And there is a bit of new wind in the field of which one is the most popular, specifically until maybe the 2020s. The 2D multiband SMS was pretty popular for layer-dependent fMRI, as it is still for regular resolution fMRI, where it is still the most efficient way. In high-resolution thermal noise-dominated regimes, however, now since 2020, in the 95 papers that have been published since then, 3D EPI seems to become more popular. It has about double the number of papers that use 3D EPI as opposed to 2D or multiband sequences. And there are a few differences with respect to those and their sensitivity to artifacts. And maybe most notably, or discussed early in the literature, are things like these off-resonance effects or dephasings. So off-resonance effects should be there theoretically in 3D EPI. They are just not as apparent. Very often they kind of average out. They're still there in case-based though. The second thing is kind of these dephasings, which are sometimes not as severe in 3D EPI because you have the other case-based segments that don't have it completely decayed away. Most notably, and the reason why it I think is becoming the standard, is the higher TSNR for 3D EPI as opposed to 2D EPI in the thermal noise dominated regime. If you're not thermal noise dominated, for example, if you're having tasks that have kind of unconventionally a lot of motion or field drifts or something like that, it might not be the best choice to use 3D EPI. So for example here, in this case from Jason Avery, who is interested in taste studies in the insula, looking at scans where people need to swallow and drink inside the scanner, you can see that for 3D EPI, the center of the brain is basically unusable, right? It's just artifacts. For 2D, while being noisy, it wiggles a bit, but it's not unusable. There's still kind of usable signal there. So for those studies, it's not entirely clear which one is the best still. So right now he's looking at that in his pilots. If you have cases where you're just limited mostly by thermal noise, then 3D EPI is usually the popular choice out there, even though it's not perfect. Like, it does have still artifacts. For example, these kind of low spatial frequency ghosts that are there, even when you go from 2D to 3D. And there are approaches to account for them, even though they also come along with kind of going into the more experimental regime of the methods out there. So for example, just a standard 2D EPI with high bandwidth close to the mechanical resonances sometimes make entire hemispheres unusable. So not only on top of the off-resonance effects, you have these kind of low spatial frequency ghosts, which can be significantly reduced when you use these advanced methods like dual polarity grappa, developed here and from Jonathan Polimeni, that can account for a lot of these off-resonance effects. They do not account for all of the trajectory imperfections though. So current developments, for example in 3D EPI, that are being investigated is to reverse the redirection, to kind of account for these trajectory errors during the readout and then combine multiple readout directions and get a kind of artifact clean image. Dependent on the reconstruction though, this comes along with slower TR, which might not be always advised for neuroscience application studies. Let's go to the next of the four issues that we have, namely the distortions. And Saskia already introduced them a bit, but with respect to the deep brain structure, I would like to reiterate some of this real quickly. Let's talk about distortions. So as you might remember from your school physics classes, magnetic fields can be described with magnetic dipoles and these magnetic field lines. And the density of the field line basically states how strong the magnetic field is. And basically a spatial gradient of a magnetic field is then the local variance of your density. So let's say we have our dipole over here and we are interested in this brane area up there. So now if we look at the spatial gradient in this direction, we see that it goes from low density of field lines to high density of field lines. So here we have a huge gradient going on. Whereas, however, in the same area, if we go left or right, the density is always kind of low. It's low here, it's even lower there, but overall there's a small gradient in the left-right direction. Now if we go to our brain and we have our ear canal here, which has a different sustainability because it's air and not tissue, and we have our deep brain area over there, we basically are right in this situation, that we have our dipole and we have our gradient right above the ear canal in our deep brain structures. And this has huge effects on, for example, the entorhinal cortex. However, luckily, we just need to adjust our phase encoding direction in the area where we are least limited by it. So for example, in the entorhinal cortex, if we have the phase encoding direction up down, basically the entire cortex is collapsed into less than a voxel, right? The entire part of the brain is basically, it looks like gone. However, when we change the phase encoding direction, this area is still resolvable. And I'm not saying that the distortions are just in a different direction. No, the distortions are just gone because in the redirection, we are not sensitive to those gradients as badly. So basically, you can really reduce the distortions in your area of interest by adjusting the slab orientation again. And you might have compromises, though, in other areas. Here, for example, you're slightly more limited by distortions in the front. So next, let's talk about the transmit field. Not only the receive field that is responsible for the low TSNR in the center of the brain here, but also the transmit field, just to get good flip angles in the deep brain structures over there. I was very excited when I got access to Terra or 70 Plus scanners because they are advertised as having integrated mechanisms to do plug-and-play PTX shimming. And usually those are advertised with images like that from this amazing Pasteur package using the universal pulses, where you can see that there's this lot of inhomogeneity, specifically in the deep brain structures, that they're basically resolved and come back to life as soon as you use PTX. However, the frustrating part for fMRI is that when you use this Pasteur package, which is awesome, and then in the next run in the same person you use your own EPI scan, you see that the PTX is not helping you that much, right? And the reason being here is that usually for this conventional plug-and-play PTX, we're usually just using B1 shimming of the magnitude and the phase. Whereas for these advanced PTX stuff, for example, the universal pulses, you have more than that kind of shimming. You also have KT points, you have gradients during the pulse. So with STX, you cannot use the KT points so efficiently, so PTX allow you to use KT points very efficiently and make it usable. However, it also means that PTX alone is not really responsible for this homogenization. It's more the gradients. PTX makes the gradients then more efficient. But just doing PTX shimming doesn't help so much for the conventional fMRI sequences that you're using, especially if you do a bias field correction of those PTX and STX examples here, you see that it's basically indistinguishable. The more annoying and concerning part, if you want to do PTX on those kind of plug-and-play systems, is that the PTX Nova coil that comes along with the Terra has more electronics in the transmit side, right? Of course, because you have more channels. However, I've heard that this additional electronics makes it harder to really completely decouple the receive side, the 32-channel receive coil, from the transmit coil. So even though the receive coil is identical for the PTX and STX Nova coils, the noise characteristic is not. So when you do a lot of grappa, for example, you have G-factor penalties, this noise amplification we talked about, and for the PTX coil, this is just always larger compared to the STX coil, especially when you do a bit liberal grappa, like if you push grappa a lot. So overall, PTX might not be the solution that I was hoping for. Especially also with the common designs that are used right now. For example, the 8-channel Nova coil that comes along with the Terra you have these kind of 8 channels aligned in this kind of circular fashion. This means that you don't really have any degree of freedom to push the magnetic field down the transmit field. You can homogenize the signal intensity and the flip angle within an axial plane, which is not really something that we are super limited with layer-dependent fMRI. We want to push it down, which this kind of setup does not allow us to do. And I'm waiting for more developments being plug and play in the future. One feedback that I got from Saskia when I showed her these slides was that I shouldn't end with such a kind of negative tone, because at the end it is possible to do high quality layer dependent fMRI also in these deep brain structures, not only up there. So I want to show you a few examples that have been acquired over the last month or so. So for example, some of the hardest areas like the amygdala can be imaged. Here for example you see that for fearful faces versus objects, a lot of face areas are being activated, but the stuff that I would like to highlight your attention to is the amygdala. So if you do a good segmentation, have a good compromise, and in this case I'm actually using PTX because I didn't realize the G factor penalty at that point so much and was more limited by transmit than receive. It is possible with 30 minutes of data to get good high-resolution signal also down there in the amygdala. Here another example, using in-plane segmentation in 3D EPI and using this approach of the dual polarity averaging to get rid of these low spatial frequency ghosts that I talked about. You can see that also these kind of central areas like the superior corniculi can be activated functionally. So here just for a simple task of bright screen versus dark screen, you not only see activity in the primary visual areas, but also here in the superior corniculi, even with almost double-digit TSNR values. You see that two-fold segmentation is not really enough to account for these huge distortions down there or over here, but in the area of interest, it is manageable. And the last example that I want to show you are things kind of even deeper down, for example, in the cerebellum, where if you do a good segmentation with 3D EPI at 0.8 millimeter resolution now with XTX, just averaging long enough with a good readout, you can see that we have these activations in the cerebellum. Here for our motor task, where we show a video versus fixation. The video obviously engages visual cortex and the tapping engages the primary sensory motor system, but also in the cerebellum we have the somatosensory motor activity. Actually, we would like to see 2 clusters, that one and the deeper one. However, you see that for the deeper one, we are really getting into kind of a fuzzy regime of single-digit TSNRs. But it's definitely possible to do deep brain layer fMRI. Okay, so next let's talk about how we use all this knowledge that we have so far about the trade-offs and the degrees of freedom that we have to really get most out of it for our neuroscientific application study in layer-dependent fMRI. And I did get this question, so you did all these nice block designs with the flickering checkerboards, but how do I actually optimize it for neuroscience application studies? And to be honest, like, I don't do checkerboards in block designs because I like to do boring neuroscience, or because I particularly care about how checkerboards are represented in the primary visual cortex, but simply because this is something that works, right? And that's a limit in layer-dependent fMRI, to find out kind of what works and how we get this together with the neuroscience. So now I would like to show you a few examples of how you can harmonize your paradigm and your protocol from my experience of the last few years. And with paradigm, I basically mean the stimulation, the task, the timing, if you use events or blocks. And by protocol, I mean a specific set of sequence parameters like TR, your contrast, your readout, your specific acquisition parameters that I talked about. So first example, let's look here at the respiration curve of a cognitive task that was particularly challenging. So here participants saw strings of letters like X, W, E, F, and then they had to sort it according to the alphabet, which is a hard task, right? And they had to focus really. And all the black arrows here are pointing to events where they had these strings of letters and had to sort them according to the alphabet. And you can see certain features that always when there's a black arrow, the respiration almost disappears, right? So they really focus and think about it and almost forget how to breathe, right? Which obviously has effect on their oxygenation level in their vessels. But in some cases, like here, you see that they focus, they almost don't breathe, and then they press the right button and they breathe in and out and are relaxed, right? So this can really result in artifacts. So for example, when you look at your activation maps for this kind of experiment, you do see that in this tiny part of the brain where we would like to see our representation of this alphabetization, it's right under this artifact. You're not really clear. There could be something, maybe not, maybe yes, I don't know. So what can you do about that? In this example, I would actually try to change the acquisition protocol. And there are a few approaches you can do. For example, you can use more grappa, which makes you more thermal noise limited. So you might need more trials and more runs to get the same statistical power at the end. But at the end, you're not as sensitive to these field offsets because your effective echo spacing with more grappa is less. So these ghostings that we are seeing here might also be reduced. So that might be one approach. But there's another approach, which is actually the approach that we then used in the study, and basically just changing the slab orientation, because this comes from ghosting. And if you change your orientation to have kind of nothing from where the ghost could be coming from, then you're not as sensitive to it, and you basically can remove it like that. So basically we went for a sagittal protocol instead, even though this was halfway through the study and already our 7th participant. There are other things of how you can harmonize your paradigm and your protocol, not only by changing your protocol, but also by changing your paradigm. So ask not what layer fMRI can do for you, but ask what you can do to the paradigm so you most benefit from layer-dependent fMRI. And usually there are a lot of things that you can do. It might change the timings, it might be annoying, and you might need to have fallback options to some of these very clever designs out there, ancient designs that allow you to do specific fast neuroscience questions and processing questions at a lower spatial scale. But very often it can be very advantageous to also redesign your neuroscientific protocol, even though you're very familiar with it already. One approach in doing that would be, for example, by really focusing on the time domain. So let's look at the temporal frequency spectrum of fMRI. Here we have a power spectrum of a fast sampling approach like HCP style in fMRI. This is low spatial resolution, so it can be sampled very fast. At very high temporal frequencies, you then have this cardiac noise, and then a bit lower frequencies, you have these respiratory noise, and then at the very low frequencies, you have this 1/f noise. This is scanner drifts, instabilities, heating of gradients, and so on. So those are definitely frequency bands and timings that you do want to avoid usually if you want to have the best sensitivity. Now for layer-dependent fMRI, the situation is slightly trickier. Because in layer fMRI protocols, we usually have a power spectrum like this, where we cannot really go to the high temporal frequencies anyway. I mean, ultimately we could, but it's just very inefficient to go there. If you have high spatial resolution and you want to do it fast, as I showed you, you can do it with a lot of grappa, but it will be noisy like hell. So it will not be efficient, and you might need to average for a year to get good results out of it. If you, with thin slabs, go a bit slower, you might have better efficiency. If you go slower even, you might have better sensitivity. And if you are not doing less than maybe grappa 2, 3, then you're not really gaining a lot by going even slower for a given duration. So usually just going slower helps a lot, not going fast. So you have more sensitivity. Then the next kind of block that is kind of blocked out for layer-dependent fMRI is usually kind of everything in between here, simply because in layer-dependent fMRI, people are often worried about variable HRFs. So superficial layers very often have kind of faster responses compared to the deeper layers, or the other way around, depending on the contrast and protocol you're using. This means that for a given protocol with a specific timing in that domain, you cannot really be sure if your superficial layer is weaker than your deeper layer simply because it has a slower response, or if this is just due to the fact that there's actually less neural activity in there. So very often people kind of try to avoid this frequency spectrum because of that. On top of that, we cannot really go much slower either, because we are in this low bandwidth domain where we are really, really sensitive to frequency drifts, more than conventional resolutions. On top of that, we are really driving the gradients to their limit, so they're heating up. We just have more frequency drifts to begin with. And this basically leaves this tiny acquisition window over here where we have the best contrast to noise ratio to encode our task. So this means we cannot go too fast, but also not too slow. And I would like to show you this example here, that for a common design that's established in cognitive neuroscience, namely random event-related design, where you will have two conditions and you randomly switch back and forth between those two conditions. So just by chance, you start with condition 1, then by chance you have the next trial in condition 2, then by chance again condition 2, condition 1, and so on. And then by chance, it just happens that very often you have a same condition back to back many times. This means that for a random event, you're not really having one frequency spectrum, but basically you have a distribution of temporal frequencies. This can make it inefficient, right? Because we have this one temporal frequency where we are most sensitive and we have the best detection sensitivity. So in the sensitivity limited domain, it might not be very efficient to use a random event related design, and you can easily change this, for example, to a manually sorted or pseudo-random event-related design where you block out certain temporal frequencies. For example, here looking at this area that we care about, you can see that by avoiding these low temporal frequencies that sometimes often are even filtered away with drift corrections, you can have much better detection power by resorting your trials, that you don't have a lot of power in the low temporal frequencies. Again, coming back to timing, I think it is not only penalized to do fast sampling and short trials because you have less TSNR and TSNR efficiency with fast event-related designs, but there's another dimension on top of that, namely that the HRF is just slow. So I would like to show you this example. It's an old example where I, by accident, didn't set my triggers correctly. And while I wanted to do a 30-second on, 30-second off design and repeat it 24 times, I ended up doing a 50-second on, 15-second off, but have the double number of trials. Then I looked at it and I figured, well, I have the double number of samples now, even though they are shorter. It must be the same, but in fact it isn't if you look at the set scores, right? So here we have a nice line of voxels following the cortical ribbon. Here we just have it scattered, right? Something that's going on. All the values are certainly weaker. I need about double the time to get to the same significant scores as those ones. And the reason here is being that in the sensitivity limited domain, it's always more efficient to have few high quality long trials with a good effect size as many short ones with a less high effect size. And what I mean with that is that when I look at the 30-second paradigm here, I have in this case 7 good data points with an excellent contrast to noise ratio that have the maximum effect size that I can hope for. Now, I only have one trial in my 1 minute time window, but if I do the same thing with 2 trials of 15-second stimulation, you see that HRF is just slow. It takes time to really build up this good effect size that drives our sensitivity. So for example, having 2 15-second blocks basically makes me end up with only 4 good data points instead of 7 good data points. That's almost half. So I almost need like 4 times as much data to have the same statistical significance score. So, and because I spend most of my time on these RAMs, which do not have the good contrast to noise ratio and good effect size that drives and helps my detection threshold, right? So if at all possible, it's always more efficient to use slow designs, long blocks, as much as you can. And very often, it's hard with neuroscience to do that. It feels kind of unnatural. But very often you're also deciding on whether it's possible and you can do something in a scan slot or you cannot do it. And very often also there are very clever designs out there, old designs, that you can take advantage of to also look at fast response designs with long blocks, for example. The next thing that comes to mind when trying to harmonize or finding a good compromise between protocol optimization and cognitive neuroscience is the conflict of having reproducibility versus homogeneity. So very often you have your few pilots, it kind of looks okay, and then you have your first real participant, it looks good, second real participant looks kind of good, third real participant, and it looks bad. Oh damn, what do you do now, right? And those are low spatial frequency ghosts, and we have maybe acoustical resonances or mechanical resonances. So you could easily account for that with lowering your bandwidth, right? Do you do that? There are some people who think absolutely, of course, we want to have a reproducibly high quality of the data, and some people say no, this is like changing it. You cannot. And so there is this conflict of really having a reproducible acquisition with the identical parameters, which might end up with low quality, but the same parameters. And then you could also kind of harvest and appreciate the variability across different experiments, tweak your parameters to always get the best out of it, which might have consistently higher quality, but it's not as homogeneous anymore. And there are some parameters that you certainly want to change across people, like shimming. You don't want to keep it the same. But then there are also things that you probably want to keep the same, like your design, your paradigm. And bandwidth is somewhere in between, right? It kind of makes you more sensitive to shimming or less sensitive, but as soon as you change it very often, it also changes echo time, which I think is still fine, but then it changes TR. Is that still fine? Everybody needs to find its compromise over there. But it is one degree of freedom that you need to play with when you really optimize your protocol for your neuroscientific paradigm. Also, very often I'm asked, what is a good data set at the end? So for example, I did my pilot study, I have my data, how do I know it's good enough for a layer-dependent protocol, on layer-dependent study to begin with? And in order to give you a bit of guidance with respect to that, I would like to show you two sets of data, a good one and a bad one. So for example, this is a data set that I would consider slightly above average. It's quite good, it's quite representative too. It's a 2D GRE dataset. It's from Luca, in fact, and it's also the dataset that we were going to look at during the hands-on analysis session. It's 0.8 millimeter, a fairly high temporal resolution, and 40 slices. And why I think this is good is because it's not too bad on all of the quality metrics that I usually look at. And the quality metrics that I look at is most importantly TSNR. So usually for TSNR and maybe response effect sizes of 1%, I think you need to have at least a double-digit TSNR. It's not really there everywhere in the field of view, but in most areas you have pretty decent TSNR. Also, when you look at variance, you usually want to see that you have kind of true physiological variance. For example, you want to see the veins and maybe a bit of field drift changes in the skin or something, but you do not really want to have huge artifacts of EPI ghosts and so on. Another measure that I find sometimes useful is the global correlation. So basically when you have a brain mask, just extract the average signal time course from that and correlate it with each voxel. And usually this is driven by vigilance, by your task, or by physiological noise, like true physiology parameters, oxygenation changes due to breathing changes. You want to see the vessels and gray matter in this metric. Another good metric, I think, is just the thermal noise, which can be spit out in the same program that all these other quality metrics are looked at, namely the Allen skew in Laney that we'll also look at during the hands-on analysis session. And one thing that I want to mention explicitly here is that the thermal noise is not expected to be heterogeneous. As soon as we use GRAPPA and we have G-factor penalties, it is okay that the thermal noise has low spatial frequency variations across your field of view. Autocorrelation is also a very good metric that can be sometimes more sensitive to revealing artifacts that are not directly visible in TSNR maps alone. Also, I think skew and kurtosis is a very nice measure to look at artifact level, specifically ghost level. So in an ideal case, skew and kurtosis should be kind of flat within the brain. It should look like random noise. If you have arcs or ghosts in there, that usually means that you have an issue with respect to your protocol. So now, this is kind of how it looks for a good data set. Let's look at a bad data set. And this is a bad data set. It actually has higher TSNR in most of the brain, partly, I think, because it's a slower protocol and not as pushy resolution. But you can see issues directly there already, that the TSNR has these huge voids, probably the fuzzy ripples that we have there, but then also there's weird stuff in the front here. So if you look at the overall variance, you don't see just the vessels and gray matter, you basically see more kind of edges of the brain, which is not a good sign. Then if you look at the global correlation, you see that there are these kind of low spatial frequency ghosts, very different ghosts that just the variance alone would tell you. But you have these wave patterns over there. You see that it's not just gray matter. Maybe in some areas it looks anatomically reasonable, but in most areas it does not. That's a bad sign. Also, when the thermal noise looks like kind of structure of the brain, it's a bad sign. And specifically also here in skew and kurtosis measures, you do see these arcs. So highlighting how useful these measures are compared to TSNR, because in TSNR, the Pythagorean addition of different noise sources very often hides certain artifacts in TSNR because we are already thermal noise limited. So skew and kurtosis can reveal those quite nicely. So this is a bad example. Okay, so next, let's go even more specific. Let's go to the scanner and just look over my shoulder of how I set up my layerfMRI protocol. And as a disclaimer here, I'm specifically looking at the Siemens system, the 70 Tera or 70 Plus, which I think is what most people in this room probably use. So obviously you have your participants sign the consent form and make sure that they don't have any metal in or at their body. And one thing that I always say, at least for layer-dependent fMRI protocols, is if you're going to do high resolution, you need to keep your head as still as possible. Otherwise, we need to repeat some scans. So really keep them motivated, that they don't move a lot. And the specific measures also for not moving are kind of low-level methods that I use. I know that there are very high-level motion tracking, navigator-based approaches out there, which maybe are sometimes a bit overkill. In my experience, it's a lower-level method that measures that have the most efficacy. For example, just training your participant. Only inviting participants that can lie very still gives you a long way. We use these inflatable cushions where the participants can basically put them at their head, so it presses their head into the skull, and while also being in control of kind of the pressure level there, so it doesn't push your ears into the skull that badly. But importantly, give feedback. It helps a lot to give feedback. And as soon as you tell them, well, you moved a lot, we need to repeat that 10 minutes and only then I can get you out, is a great motivation for them to really lie as still as possible. So with this kind of setup, I think you cannot avoid any motion, but I think with this setup, the most of the motion that I'm seeing is actually not real motion anymore. It's kind of field motion, usually in the face encoding direction, which can still be problematic. So I know that some people are worried about that, specifically for their Krapper reference scans, that they ask the participants to kind of hold their breath or breathe very shallowly during the first 10-20 seconds of the scan and even have a fixation task in there. I'm not doing that. Some people do. Also, there are additional sources of motion. For example, having the brain pulsate inside the skull, which is just nothing you can do about it. And in fMRI, we are not as sensitive to motion as structural imaging. So motion is never really the same across the entire run, right? You lose a few TRs, okay, if people move. But overall, I think it's important to keep track of motion while performing your scan, but it's not the end of the world. So now the participant is on the table and we did the standard localizer and we are already disappointed because in layer fMRI, we are usually acquiring very thin slabs. And in this specific example, we would like to get a visual protocol here in the calcarean sulcus, but we can almost not see anything at all. So this localizer is perfect to get the borders of the brain and do your whole brain alignment of your field of view, but for layer fMRI, it's not good enough. So I find it very helpful to have an inversion recovery turbo flash, for example. It takes longer than the standard localizer. It takes like 40 seconds or so to have a few slices in all directions, but still it's worth it because then you see your calcarean sulcus, you see your motor cortex, you kind of see your anatomical landmarks and can align your slab accordingly. Now this brings me to the next thing, namely the shimming, which would be the green box here for those who don't know the Siemens way of doing things. So in the shimming, I think the first crux of the matter is that shimming is kind of binary. That a voxel is either inside the shim or outside the shim area, right? Which is not how it works for layer-dependent fMRI, right? Ideally, we would like to have the best shim in the visual cortex, where we want to get our signal, right? Maybe let's say we only want to have a 20 hertz line width for the back of the brain. And we would be able to sacrifice a bit of line width in the front, maybe going to 60 hertz, but not more than 60 hertz, because ultimately most of the reconstruction calibrations are happening still in K-space or projection space. So we cannot really sacrifice the front entirely. What I mean by that is that areas up there are still relevant to get good reconstructions back there. Specifically, for example, grappa is happening in K-space, right? So if you have very bad calibration in front there, you have a bad grappa kernel, and that grappa kernel is applied everywhere in K-space, then also in the back of the brain, you have grappa problem. On top of that, for example, is phase correction methods, even before grappa, which is, again, I say K-space, but actually I mean projection space, which is after you do the Fourier transform in the read direction, but still have not done the Fourier transform in the phase direction. This is where grappa and the Nyquist course correction is applied in the Siemens reconstruction. This means that you still have the entire image space collapsed. So the center of the projection K-space where the Nyquist course correction is happening is basically the collapsed signal of the entire slice. So you actually want to shim the front. That's basically what I want to say. On top of that, for these thin slices, the second crux in layer-dependent fMRI is that the shim is flow of Siemens is not really optimized for these thin slabs. So because, for example, the field map that Siemens acquires to optimize the shim does not have the highest spatial resolution. And we have a lot of shim terms. We have usually third order shims. Those are a lot of spherical harmonics, and you cannot really fit third order spherical harmonics to 2-3 data points within your slab, right? So usually you need to have your shim box at a minimum thickness, right? So here it's slightly thicker than our imaging. Right. If you want to look at the examples of this advanced inversion recovery localizer, you can download it from GitHub over there. So after you design the area of where you want to shim and where you want to image, you can do your calibrations. For example, a frequency adjust. And now since the VE12 upgrades that most of the scanners have now, you can also see the full width have maximum. And 240 is certainly not a great value, even though this value is not perfectly interpretable anyway. For some kind of deep brain field of use, very often when you have like more brain inside your field of view, it looks sharper, which does not mean it's actually better. So this is a relative value, the full width have maximum. Very often for these tilted visual protocols, you have a larger full width have bandwidth compared to the sagittal, for example, auditory protocols. We want to get this as small as possible, but it cannot really be compared across brain areas. That's what I want to say. So after the frequency, very often people do transmit adjust. Or I don't know how many people do that. I don't do that for that matter. Simply because the variance it introduces is actually bigger than the variance it accounts for. So for example, when you look at the transmit fields of here 20 participants, you can see that it's quite consistent. The spatial pattern is huge, right? There are sometimes threefold larger flip angles in the center of the brain than around. But this is the same across all people, right? The spatial pattern is very similar, and the variance across people, I think, is actually smaller than the variance across doing the adjustment multiple times. So I don't do the transmit adjust at all. Usually I set a value that I like beforehand, or I set a value that just is determined by my SAR, energy deposition limits, but I rarely do this transmit adjust at all. What I certainly do is the 3D shim. So this is basically trying to homogenize the field inside the green box that we just talked about. And there are different field maps available. And I think most of the people that I know are using the GRE brain. even though it's not always the default. I think usually the default is this DES standard. And there are some people, or actually one person, a good friend that I trust, who did a comparison and actually thinks that DES standard is better than GRE. Still, and I think most of the people I know are using the GRE brain. And then always make sure that you select it, because sometimes the system just switches it and back. And I do these iterations a few times. So I do a 3D shim, frequency adjust, 3D shim, frequency adjust, usually 3 times. And I do it 3 times simply because that's how Robin Heidemann, leading figure in the ultra high field turn from Siemens, taught me how to do that back in 2011, I think. So after I set the frequency, some people out there also then go to the interactive shim. I don't do that, but some people do and get better results as if you wouldn't do it. And specifically, the point where you go in there is the set term. For example, here from the shim from Siemens, you would have a value of minus 217. And usually it's too low. So when you increase it, for example here, by 10, you can get a better full width half maximum by a few hertz or so. And this is quite consistent. No matter which kind of protocol, if you increase this by 10, the full width half maximum is lower. It does not mean that the side lobes are also better. And it usually is not a huge game changer. But very often people change this, going 10 up, then wiggling around X, wiggling around Y, going back to Z, maybe in 2 iterations, and then leaving that, not touching the higher order terms here. To give you a perspective of kind of what these values mean, when you ask a person to do heavy breathing, then you can see that the full width half maximum easily changes from 72 to 55. So that's the kind of variance or noise level of these values. And then with third order shim, you can get slightly better, but you're doing this on a breathing person, so it's never really sure how much it helps. I don't do the interactive shim. I do the third order 3D shim frequency 3 times and then leave it. Then when I run my experiment, what I usually check with these buttons on the keyboard is just run through all the TRs in an individual run, but also run through the runs and see how much motion there is. So here, for example, you can see that this is a relatively decent participant. You see that there's a bit of movement. There's certainly these different shadings in there, which are expected because each run has a different proper reference scan, but I think this is a very good participant where I don't need to go full angry mode and tell them that they should lie still in the scanner. Then when you're on the scanner and you're not really sure, is this shading too bad or not, the things that you would consider are usually stuff at the scanner that you can only check on the scanner are the mechanical resonances, because gradients like certain echo spacings more than others. But how do we check those resonances? So in this walkthrough, I want to show you the 4 ways on how we do this at NIH. Every site does it slightly differently. And the first approach is to take your phone, download one of these spectrum analyzer apps. It's basically a guitar tuner app that uses the microphone and does a FFT. Basically, you have the sound spectrum. So pointing that towards the door or towards the waveguide of the MRI scanner, you usually get the kind of frequencies that the sequence is like most resonating on. And it's usually the frequencies around 550 hertz and 1100 hertz that are dangerous for the gradient, and therefore you want to avoid those. So here we are kind of close to it, but not too close. And this already brings us to the disadvantage of this method, namely that there's no clear cutoff. Like you don't know what is too close. How big should this kind of gain be in order to really stop the scanner? Maybe more scientifically advanced method to check the resonances are these tools that are distributed from some labs, for example, from Christian Labadie at the Max Planck Institute at CBS, basically simulating the sequence for a given protocol and then doing an FFT of those gradients, where you can then also again see where the biggest peaks are in that specific protocol. But again, here it doesn't really exactly tell you how big of a frequency is too big, right? So you always have sub-peaks or aliasing in the forbidden frequency bands, but how big are they allowed to be is kind of unclear. But this is kind of helpful to optimize your protocol and allow you to kind of shift the frequencies away. One easy way also that some sites do is to not do kind of analyze your gradients by looking at the resonances, but basically directly looking at the image quality. Just go through different echo spacings or bandwidth and then just see where you have the biggest ghost level. So here, for example, you see that you have a lot of ghost, which probably suggests that you are close to the mechanical resonances, and this is not really healthy for the gradient. The kind of only ultimate truth is to use the inherently built sensors provided from the vendor, here Siemens for example, because those actually do have hard cutoffs where the scanner starts to shut down. So for example, you can check the temperature of the water from the cooling of the magnets, or the gradients more. If you go to option local service, you usually are asked to provide a password. The local service password sometimes is stored in the help menu as an annotation. Probably you know that already. And then you can go into this local service environment and then click on magnet and cooling, where you then get a page, for example, like this, where you can see the in and outgoing temperature of the water. For example, if the outgoing water, the secondary level is above 25 degrees Celsius, then usually the scanner starts spitting out warnings. Another approach is to look at the log files. For example, for Siemens here or in Medcom, there is this per coil temperature log that you can check, and there usually the scanner starts to shut down as soon as you increase a gradient temperature of 65 degrees Celsius. So you can check all of those while you're doing your layer-dependent fMRI experiment in order to make sure you're not damaging your gradient. Specifically, this is important when you have very, very long runs. What are the parameters that we can tune to move away from these mechanical resonances? In order to make this clearer, I would like to again go through the basics of EPI, where, as Saskia showed, we're going through k-space back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. How can we change this pattern and the resonance or the frequency of going back and forth and back and forth? So usually each line here consists of a gradient pulse looking like that. We ramp up, slowly turning it on, then we leave it on at a certain strength, and then we ramp down again. And there are a lot of parameters that determine this shape. For example, there's the overall gradient amplitude, like basically how high elevated is this plateau. Then there is a duration or duration ratio between the plateau and the flat top. And then all together, the ramp, the flat top, and the down, then determine your echo spacing. But independently of that, also, you have this ADC duration, basically how long your ADCs are open, how long you're sampling signal. And even though there are these 7 parameters here, there's actually only one easy parameter in the Siemens environment that you can control that. And common misconceptions are that these amplitudes are definitely not at the amplitudes of the maximum what the gradient can achieve. So the Terra gradients are advertised as being 80 millitesla per meter. We are not getting even close to that value, rather in the 50s or so. Then on top of that, we have body gradients. So we cannot really maximize and control this shape very well, because before we go to the limit of the amplifiers, we're actually running into peripheral nerve stimulations. So the only parameter that we can really adjust all those 7 parameters in the same time is the bandwidth, the readout bandwidth, which determines basically how long our ADC is open. And as we change this internally in the EPI kernel, the sequence adjusts everything else. It adjusts the flat top, it adjusts the ratio of the ramp sampling, and the higher you go in the bandwidth, very often the less of the ramp sampling it allows. So ramp sampling is the single most efficient parameter that you can tune to change everything in this profile. There is one kind of binary approach too, namely the gradient mode, which literally determines the slope. While the slope for a given gradient mode is always the same, normal or fast, it's always the same, independent of the bandwidth. You can make it a bit faster or a bit less fast. And if you make it normal and not fast, then it also allows you to use a higher ramp sampling. One common misconception is that echo time actually does not change this pulse shape at all. If you increase the echo time, it does not relax the EPI readout to match the k-space center with the center of this readout. No, it just adds an additional dead time between the excitation pulse and the readout. All right, let's go to the last section of the presentation, namely the quiz. So let's look at some real life data and see how we can optimize them. So here, this is a whole brain layer fMRI protocol. It's a bit more than 5-second TR, fairly aggressive acceleration with this kind of sampling pattern. It looks bad, right? Some areas are just black, typical artifacts maybe. What can we do about that? Option 1. These are low frequency ghosts from mechanical resonances of the gradients, and you can easily change them by changing your readout bandwidth. Option 2. You change nothing. Doing manual adjustments is subjective. It does introduce circularity and just makes you a bad scientist. If you allow manual interventions and manual changes, you can always tweak your parameters until you get what you see, right? This is p-hacking right out of the books. Never change it. Option 3. These are typical phase errors from low bandwidth of layer fMRI and the long readouts, right? So using dual polarity Krappa can reduce those artifacts. And maybe from hearing my tone already tells you that I'm not a fan of option 2, which might be an option. I would favor option 1 and 3, which might be similarly effective. In this example, I just increased the bandwidth a tiny little bit, and you can see I actually reduced the bandwidth. Sorry, I increased the TR and the echo spacing respectively. So going from 5.4 seconds to 5.5 seconds, a 2% reduction in your readout speed basically takes care of those artifacts quite nicely. As always, going slow can be more efficient. Let's look at the next example here, which I think is an example that I've been confronted many times. So this is a 2D multiband sequence, and when you look at the TSNR, it's not homogeneous, right? Some slices just have higher TSNR compared to other slices. So what could be the reason for that, and what can we do about it? Option 1, this is a sequence bug, just update to the latest CMR version. Option 2, you need to use Kuiper field of view shifting. Option 3, there's nothing you can do about it. You need to live with it. And maybe surprisingly, in this case, I think option 3 applies. Because the G-factor penalty in multiband SMS imaging is smooth within the plane, but it's not smooth across planes, no matter if you do Kuiper or not. So here, for example, let's look at an example where we don't do Kuiper field of view shifting. So basically having the two slabs right aliased on top of each other. And there you can see that the bottom of the top slab is basically aliased and coming from signals at the bottom of the lower slab, right? So those two voxels are right overlaid on top of each other here. So unaliasing them is tricky, right? We have two signals that we need to tease apart. So this means we have Krappa noise amplification. This is a G-factor. So the bottom of the top slab just have a larger G-factor compared to the top of the lower slab, because the top of the lower slab is actually aliased from air, from nothing up there, right? So the G-factor is not as bad here. There's no noise amplification. And this basically means that we always have, without Kuiper, a lower TSNR at the bottom of the top slab compared to the top of the bottom slab. Now let's assume we do have Kuiper. Then still the bottom of the top slab would be aliased from down there at the bottom of the lower slab. And this is in the center of the brain. We don't have any encoding, spatial encoding from the coil elements. All coil elements have the same sensitivity there. So it's very hard to unalias that. We have high G-factor penalty. Whereas the top of the bottom slab comes from aliased from up there, where we are close to the different coils. We have a lot of spatial encoding of the different elements. So the G-factor penalty is still lower. So no matter what we do, just because of the physics of the SMS approach, we do not expect the TSNR to be homogeneous. We just don't see it very often at conventional fMRI because there we are more physiological noise dominated. Here we are thermal noise dominated, so we see this clearer. This is normal. The next quiz would be this data set. So we're going through different TRs here, and I'm asking you, how many artifacts do you see here? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it more? I think it's more, right? Let's look at a few of them. So here we have ICA components, and one of them is coming from field problems. Basically, when you have a sample in the field, it changes the field, it distorts the field, and when you move in the field, then you have these kind of artifacts. The second one might be vascular artifacts. I think it was specifically visible down there, pulsating, right? This is usually a signal that we don't care about. Then here we actually might have had a working memory paradigm, but people have resting state on top of that and wiggle with their fingers during the scan. So we also have neural components that actually are overlaid on the stuff that we care about. And so it could be an artifact too. And then we also had these intermittent ghostings, which is amplified here in this example, which comes from the fact that the different EPI lines are actually not like perfectly adjusted as they should be. So we have at least 4 sources of artifacts, but this is never the limit, right? You can always point fingers and see more and more and more. So for example, here white matter is just darker here than there. Why is that? Is that a different kind of white matter? Probably not, right? You have kind of residual fat ghost over there. Then we have kind of outside the brain, there's structure. It's not just random noise. Where is this coming from? Then we have this white spot over here. We have these dark voxels forming a line over there. Another source of ghost, right? It never ends. There's always more sources of artifact. So then, next question. Are those data usable? Maybe, right? Depends on the question, I guess. I'm asking it because recently in these discussions in the field, for example, with respect to the AFNI QA special issue, there were kind of these very puristic scientists who rejected more than 90% of the data as saying they are unusable. So very often we want to have the best data that we can get, and sometimes it makes you a better scientist if you only work with the best data and have the highest quality standards. But at the end, a scientist who doesn't have data is also not a good scientist. So we need to find our compromise there. And in my opinion, I think this data set is still usable. In fact, we saw it, that we have nice neural components visible there. So I think the proof is in the pudding. If it's usable, it's usable. Then the second last question I want to ask, and to kind of get the transition to Saskia's next presentation going, is about structural imaging. So we have here 2 images. One of them looks better than the other one. What's the difference here? Option 1, this is partial Fourier in 2 directions. You should never do partial Fourier in 2 directions. It does not make sense and just makes you a bad scientist. Option 2, this was an inflatable cushion that was leaking. Option 3, it's just too much grappa. Reduce the grappa and do it again. And I can tell you the answer. This is actually my brain. And it was at the end of a long session and my ears were pressing into the skull, so I released air from the cushions. I shouldn't have done so. But luckily, these data were acquired with Fat Navigator. So this is the same case-based data, just reconstructed differently using these phase navigators or not. And this is a sequence distributed from Cardiff here with an MP2 range, which is slightly longer than a regular MP2 range, but you have this option to reconstruct offline your data if you have these motion effects. Now, the last question I want to ask in order to prime you for the hands-on analysis session later is this artifact. I did my study, I have my activated areas in my RI, and I look at my layer profile and I see features that I like to see. The most reproduced feature in layer-dependent fMRI, namely that the surface is kind of stronger than the deeper layers. I might even have a shoulder. But then white matter is weird. It just doesn't go down to 0. Why is that? Option 1. This comes from large training veins at the gray matter-white matter border. And if you use a shorter echo time, this is slightly reduced. Option 2. This is a voxel selection bias. It is reduced if you use a different ROI. Option 3, this is partial voluming. It is reduced when you use smaller voxels. So basically you just have signal from gray matter and white matter. It's not purely white matter just yet. And I think all of those options can contribute to elevated signals at the deepest layers. But in this specific case, the true answer is option 2. It's a selection bias, because at the superficial layers, all voxels have enough signal that they basically exceed the detection threshold. In the deeper layers, though, voxels don't have as much veins in there, so they are not as kind of responsive. So many of those voxels are actually false negatives. And therefore, if I only get the positive ones that happen to have noise on top of it to make it above the threshold basically means that we have an elevated signal there. So one way to account for this is to not only look at voxels that are significantly activated, but only look at entire columns that are activated. It might still have a similar bias in there, but it's certainly reduced a lot. And there are other ways of how you can pool your signals. For example, by RIs based on anatomical landmarks, or also based on studies or pilots that are at low spatial frequencies. For example, a localizer task, even though they also might have the issue that they are more sensitive to veins compared to columns that have less signal in there. And I think there is no clear standard of how you select your voxels, and maybe all of them are kind of appropriate if you really kind of understand of how it's defined. And with this, I thank you for your attention.